All right, hi everyone. We're going to start now. So thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on skills development and economic opportunity for young women. My name is Radhika Mitter and I work at the Results for Development Institute, and I also help lead the YouthPower Learning Cross-Sectoral Skills Community of Practice. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just start off by going through our agenda. Okay, so first off, this webinar is really a joint initiative between two community of practices, the cross-sectoral community of practice, as well as the gender and positive youth development community of practice. In light of International Women's Day, which is tomorrow, we really saw this webinar as an opportunity to collaborate and learn more about what's happening in the field of skills development and gender. And so the aim of this webinar is really to see what kinds of barriers do young women face upon entering into the workforce and thriving within the workforce, and what kinds of interventions and programs are best suited to tackling these challenges. So joining me today is Chelsea Ricker from the Gender Community of Practice, and I'm going to hand it over to her in just a minute to introduce herself. But before that, I did want to quickly mention that throughout this presentation, we do have a chat box open for all of you to participate, and we also have a question and answer section, which you should be able to see. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions for specific speakers or just more general questions, feel free to pose them and we will discuss them towards the end. So I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea to talk a little bit about herself and her community of practice.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Radhika, for the introduction. So my name is Chelsea Ricker. I'm a principal and founding member of the Torchlight Collective and consulting group focused on youth engagement in development and social justice fields. And I'm here representing the Gender and Positive Youth Development Community of Practice, which I co-lead with Chisida Kapungu at the International Center for Research on Women. The Gender and Positive Youth Development Community of Practice is focused on sharing learning about what works and measurements of efforts in integrating gender into positive youth development broadly and also within YouthPower as a whole. We're focused, my apologies for the siren. We're focused on looking at learnings across transformation of gender norms in programs such as skills development and economic opportunity, looking at ways in which programs integrate gender-based violence and engage men and boys in changing gender norms, and at closing gender gaps and systems. So I'm going to pass it back over to Radhika, and I'm looking forward to hearing the presentations and having a bit of a discussion today.
Thanks, Chelsea. So before I go ahead and introduce our speakers for today, I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about the cross-sectoral skills community of practice. We are a group of about 250 members, and our goals really are to facilitate members' exchange of knowledge and experiences and ideas to build a better understanding within our group of cross-sectoral skills, their current role, and their potential for impact on positive youth development. And really through all of this, we hope to contribute to our field through the co-creation of knowledge and collaborative research addressing key challenges within cross-sectoral skills development for youth, such as skills measurement, program effectiveness, etc. And so over the past year, we've had a number of events. Just a few months ago, we had a webinar on a webinar and technical brief on targeting recruitment and retention. And this is the second webinar in our series of webinars. So that's just briefly in a nutshell what we do. And I'm going to go back now to our agenda and get us started with our presentations for today. So we have a great lineup of speakers. We have Sarah Gamage joining us from the International Center for Research on Women. We have Aukje Tekat from Aflatoon International in Amsterdam. And from Creative Associates, we have Jackie Ogega and Sarah Phillips joining us today. So each speaker will present for about 10 minutes, and then we will reserve 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentations for questions. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Gamage now. And so Sarah Gamage is the Director of Gender, Economic Empowerment, and Livelihoods at ICRW. Her presentation will look at the data on persistent gender inequalities in the labor market and will highlight some of the interventions both on the demand and the supply side that can foster young women's access to better jobs and improved labor market outcomes. So Sarah, if you want to go ahead and activate your microphone and camera, and you can start presenting.
Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. One sec, I'll activate the camera. I apologize. Please excuse the really odd, the odd angle. We just moved into a new office, or we've had our offices redecorated, so everything's a bit of a shambles right now. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the gender outcomes in the labor market globally, and then try and sort of drill down to some of the skills development, workforce development programs that I think we're probably all really interested in as one way to really improve outcomes for young women in the labor market, and also improve outcomes in terms of their economic empowerment and autonomy. This is based on an overview of research that we did recently that was really just a general scan of the literature on women's economic empowerment and the state of women in labor markets. And so it really is a sort of synoptic overview, and I'm sure if you've been following things like the UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, or you've been looking at progress of the world's women, or even women at work from the ILO, these are all figures and statistics that you're very familiar with. But what we clearly see when we look at outcomes in the labor market for women and also for young women is that despite substantial progress, we know that people are getting more educated, more people are in school, we still don't see improved outcomes, significantly improved outcomes for women in the labor market. So the substantial gender gaps remain in both developed and developing countries. Fewer women work in paid employment compared to men. Women frequently earn less income for similar work. Women cluster in more precarious and lower value-added sectors, and disproportionately in part-time employment, particularly in middle and upper-income countries. We also know that social norms, discrimination, legal barriers to mobility, and gender-based violence also limit women's ability to participate in labor markets on equal terms with men. And then when we sort of dig into the literature on how you get access to a job, how you find work, stay in work, how you get access to the other kinds of services that support your ability to stay in work, we realize that women may face greater information asymmetry and they have more limited social networks, or that their social networks tend to be very confined and don't necessarily overlap into broader economic spheres. So just looking at gender gaps in labor force participation, just over the 2000s, we do see that labor force participation of women is rising in most regions, with the exception of a few regions. And I think this is really important to notice. So the gap in labor force participation between men and women is actually going down in most regions, with the exception of South Asia and Europe and Central Asia. What does this mean? Well, this probably means that there are certain types of barriers and restrictions to women's labor force participation that are either increasing, or that the transition from low-income to middle-income countries, or the transition from the former Soviet Union, where there were commitments to employment, to more marketized economies, where there are less commitments to full employment, has affected women significantly. And so this is where we see those outcomes, particularly in South Asia and Europe and Central Asia, that actually gaps in labor force participation are rising. Disproportionately, women find themselves concentrated in services, although in sub-Saharan Africa we do see that women, the greatest sector of absorption of women's labor force is in agriculture. The same is also true in South Asia. When looking at the data on formal and informal sector employment, and here we're using data from key indicators of the labor market from the ILO, what we see actually is a sort of changing pattern. In some countries and in some regions, women disproportionately concentrate in the informal economy, and that they actually are the greatest numbers of people working in the informal economy. But that's not true everywhere. I think that where we're particularly concerned about women's inability to transition out of informal employment is in sub-Saharan Africa and also in South Asia. These gender gaps translate into gender wage gaps. When you've got very segmented labor markets, when women are being channeled into certain types of activities and certain sectors, what you tend to see is this underpins gender wage gaps. And so we still have significant gender wage gaps, although they're declining in most regions, again with the exception of Europe and Central Asia. And the decline is very small in South Asia, but significant gender gaps remain in terms of wages. So what does this mean if we're beginning to devise different types of solutions to support women, different types of policy environments, programmatic environments to support women, and particularly young women in that transition from school to employment? And what we tend to see is that most of these initiatives focus on the supply side. How can you change the nature of the employee in order to better fit them to employment opportunities? Now, these seem to be very effective, but I do think we need to be mindful of the fact that you probably need levers that operate both on the supply and the demand side simultaneously, because what you might be doing, particularly when you target more vulnerable, lower skilled workers, is merely shuffling who gets to the front of the queue, and not necessarily expanding the opportunity set in terms of employment opportunities. So these programs can be very effective, and we've got some great data on how they are effective, but they need to be embedded in a macroeconomic framework that also is committed to stimulating employment. And they need to be acting at the same time in concert with demand-side initiatives. But what we tend to see is that most of the work that we've reviewed focuses on the supply-side initiatives, workforce development, education, TVET, improving the quality of the labor supply, and improving the matches of workers to jobs. And that's where the intermediation services come in. And I think we've got some phenomenal data out there and some really very good programs that tell us they are effective. But what's very interesting, when you start to dig into the literature, there's less critical analysis of why they might be more effective. And I think some of the differences are related to differences in the ability to resolve and respond to care deficits. In contexts and countries where there are high fertility rates or where the state and the market don't necessarily automatically resolve care deficits, and where there are high care deficits caring for children, the elderly, the infirm, women often enter and exit the labor market more frequently. They have weaker attachments to that labor market. And I think when we take that back and think about the design of different types of vocational education, TVET, different types of workforce development programs, we need to be thinking about how to resolve care deficits and how to mediate work and care, because that, I think, is the particular challenge that women face in these contexts. So when we look at some of the programs, one of the ones that we evaluated was the Youth in Action, Jóvenes en Acción in Colombia. And this was evaluated by Atanasio and Kugler et al. And they find that women offered training earned about 18% more than those who weren't offered training. Now, we find lots of different types of results like this, including they do a very careful analysis of the rate of return on the investments in workforce development. And this really tells us a great deal about how it is that these programs have secured greater labor market attachment and retention over time and improved outcomes for women. Another set of programs that I think are very promising are girls in STEM education, getting girls into science, into math, and into engineering, technology jobs. The problem we face here is that, in fact, there's a huge lag between investing in these skills and them actually translating into improved outcomes, reduced labor market segmentation, better wages, improved access to STEM jobs later on, because the lag is actually much greater, because this type of training is usually post-secondary school and longer. But commitments to it are definitely yielding results in terms of increasing the proportion of women in STEM education and in STEM careers. And I think another source of potential program and policy that we really need to look at with greater critical analysis is some of the conditional cash transfers and educational outcomes programs, because they're clearly keeping girls in school, improving outcomes for girls as they're being educated. The challenge here is the transition from these programs into the workforce, and I think that's where we need to learn more about how to support that transition in the workforce. We've got many other types of labor market intermediation services, these matching services. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to leap forward to the end of this. And we've seen some very powerful programs in terms of digital job matching, using new platforms to create better matches between workers and employers. And there was a very important program that took place in the West Bank and Gaza, where women make up 19% of the labor force, but 35% of this particular job matching platform, and they were finding jobs, and it looks like it's going to be very positively evaluated in terms of their ability to access and retain employment. Similar work has been done on job placement in India. What is the sort of bottom line when we start to look at these programs? In terms of the constellation of different types of services that work together well, bundling services that act on both sides of the labor market, stimulating labor demand, increasing worker skills, and linking employers and employees. And I think this is really important. And what we need to sort of look at there is to go beyond the programs that merely just sort of create commitments for those who are trained, but that actually look at some of the sort of macroeconomic policies and frameworks that stimulate demand. So there's sectoral policy that can be very powerful in terms of investing in care services. This can actually increase the likelihood that women enter the labor force, but it can also create primary jobs in the caring sector. And where those jobs are decent jobs, then this is really something that can underpin quite a powerful transition. We do also know that we need to support investments in legislative and institutional environments, because where we see commitments to non-discrimination, or where we see commitments to mandate the ability of employees to negotiate with their employers around how much work and how much caring they do without losing their jobs, then we begin to see some very powerful outcomes for women in terms of less time out of the labor force for caring, quicker return to work when they have been caring, particularly after parental leave. So there are some really important levers, policy levers, that we shouldn't forget, and that are very important for young women and women of reproductive age. And finally, I think we really need to look very closely at those investments beyond education, at secondary and tertiary levels, that really can mediate women's ability to enter and remain in the labor force. So I think including policies like transport policy. So I think we have a lot of meat for us to think about when we talk about what are the kinds of policy and programmatic levers that can produce better outcomes for women in the labor market, and particularly for young women in that crucial transition from education to employment. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to hold off on question and answers until the end of the 3 presentations. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker for today. We have Alkia Tikat joining us from Aflatun International, and she is a research manager at Aflatun International, and will be speaking about her research on economic empowerment programs for young women, specifically looking at contextual factors that come into play when designing and implementing these programs. So Aukia, if you want to turn on your camera and just remember to click start sharing as soon as you turn it on, and you can go ahead and present.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. What I would like to speak about today is financial education for girls. Well, as we're probably all aware of, and as Sarah has beautifully introduced, a very big challenge of today is that around 600 million adolescent girls in developing countries face challenges to education, the required resources, and the relevant skills that are needed to become economically empowered. Different types of interventions target girls, as Sarah has mentioned as well, to expand their economic opportunities, economic empowerment, and often these interventions include financial education components. So together with Plan International and Credit Suisse, we implement programs in Brazil, China, India, and Rwanda to provide girls with financial education and life skills, empowering the next generation of women to achieve better futures for themselves and for their communities. But parallel to that, we do not just implement those programs, but we want to contribute to knowledge and research as well. So the research component of the partnership explores the impact of financial education on adolescent girls, and we want to contribute to that debate more broadly. So we hope to increase an understanding of how financial education and life skills education programs can be used to improve the life chances, and the educational outcomes of girls. We want to make recommendations to improve the quality of these programs, and we want to develop a body of insights that can inform future program design. So in the first phase of the research that we've done, we produced a research report that we call a desk review. So this examines different intervention models for adolescent girls, and based on that, we're now we've developed a policy brief, which is the first product that we're disseminating now. It communicates the most important messages of the study that we've done, and that I am going to discuss today as well. And right now we're in the second phase of the research project, which are 4 studies in the 4 countries where we are implementing to assess the efficacy and the added value of the programmatic interventions that we're offering. Based on these 4 studies, we'll develop a synthesis report that will summarize the findings that we learned across the 4 countries. So let me speak a little bit more about the study that we've done in detail. So this was basically a review of the existing literature around the topic. I'm not going to be very technical today, but it basically asks what works for who and in what circumstances. So to our knowledge, this was the first systematic review of girls' economic empowerment programs to determine which financial education interventions are most effective. And what we did is we looked at the previous research by authors worldwide to try and identify the most promising models that include financial education and that aim to empower adolescent girls. So we found 12 evaluated programs whose objectives were exactly that. And we mapped the outcomes of these programs that are deemed most important for adolescent girls' economic empowerment. We identified the contextual factors at different ecological levels that might influence the effectiveness of a program. And finally, we defined a theory of change. So based on the results of that study, we've determined our focus for follow-up research in the 4 countries that we work in. And I'll speak about that in just a minute. Very briefly, some background on the 12 program evaluations that we found or that we used. We saw that these were all programs implemented and evaluated in Africa and Central or South Asia. So we see that the geographical variance is quite limited. Also, we saw one study from India, one study from Uganda, included both boys and girls, but the majority of the studies, so that's 10 out of 12, they were with conducted with girls only. But perhaps more interesting is the different models that we found in the programs. In this slide, you see the different components that were combined with financial education. So the first three, microfinance, vocational education, and access to saving accounts, these are still related to financial topics or services. And the last two, social or also called life skills education and SRHR education, are non-financial components. And an important result of our study is that all but one of the 12 evaluated programs combined financial education with non-financial components. So 11 out of 12 programs focused on social or life skills topic or on health topics, and sometimes both. None of these programs used financial education as a standalone component. It was always combined with other elements. So one of our key findings is that there seems to be a consensus about girl economic empowerment programs that they should cover non-economic topics in addition to financial education. But we also looked at the relevance, the rigor, and the results of every study. And our second key finding is that programs were most successful when they contained both social and financial components. So to determine success of a program, we looked at the magnitude of the positive impact on the girls immediately after the program. So if we look at these programs, 3 of them had rigorous evidence and high impact. These 3 programs happened to be in Uganda, Tajikistan, and Bangladesh, and each of them combined social and financial components and added extra components depending on the needs. So, for example, in Uganda, health and vocational training were added, and in Tajikistan, SRHR education was actually the primary focus of the program. Financial education was added as a secondary component. An interesting detail is that the most successful programs were starting with relatively older girls or boys and girls, whereas some of the other programs started as young as the age of 10. So this is something that we might want to explore further, to what extent the age influenced the success of programs like this. The evaluations all looked at outcomes like financial knowledge, attitudes, and behavior, but also stuff like self-advocacy, and some of them, some SRHR knowledge and behavior as well, depending on the focus of the program. So I'm skipping to the theory of change. Let me just walk you through it quickly. I know it's quite a lot of information, but on the left is the same intervention logic as I just showed on the previous slide. So this is the input or the intervention models that want to tackle barriers at different levels of a girl's life. You'll see the different levels in the circle, and then on the right, you'll see the outcomes of on each of those levels that these programs were trying to achieve. Ultimately, on the highest level, which is the society, which you'll see on top of the circle, financial education is aiming to contribute to shifting economic roles within the family, and ultimately looking at girls and women becoming more empowered to contribute and make decisions. At the bottom, you'll see contextual factors that influence this entire process. So examination of these programs clearly demonstrate the need for holistic thinking in program design and evaluation, in which the enabling environment is really important. So all the contextual factors in the 12 studies were listed during the study, and we made an overview of this. And I'm sure this list is not exhaustive. There's probably other contextual factors that are really important in other settings. So this list can basically be used as an inspiration for who wants to develop a program like this, just like this entire theory of change can be used as an inspiration for that. I'm being mindful of the time, and I'd like to speak about the second phase of the research as well. So I have a long list of recommendations that are all available in the policy brief that we have. So I'm just going to skip quickly to the second phase of the research. In the second phase of the research, and based on the policy brief that we wrote, we saw that contextual factors are really important in understanding the effectiveness of a program. So in the second phase of this project, we have the opportunity to do research in 4 countries where we're implementing to understand what the contextual factors are that financial education and life skills program need to understand and address, and how we should address them. So as the content is different in each program location, and the programs that Plan International implements are based on that context, every study has a slightly different focus. In Brazil, we look at how community buy-in can help improve the learning environment for financial education and life skills delivery towards enhanced girl economic empowerment. I'll just give some preliminary results for these. So the first results clearly show that making parents and the rest of the community aware is extremely important to make girls' participation effective. To really get their buy-in from the start is crucial, and we target both boys and girls in the program, but the girls, only the girls are in the clubs in Brazil. So we saw that the boys think that the skills that the girls are learning are also really important for them. So this really limits their buy-in and understanding of the program. So this is something that we want to look into for future programming. In China, an important target group for the program is girls that are left behind because their parents, they need to go to work in the city. So the parents are basically not around for the girls. So we look at how the combined delivery of financial education and life skills program, together with career guidance and counseling, can enable left behind girls to overcome marginalization and address the barriers to education and empowerment. In India, we look at which community perceptions are the biggest obstacles to girls' acquisition of financial education and life skills, and how they can be addressed to enhance girl economic empowerment. Preliminary results of this one are that when you ask the community, they're generally pretty positive about the programs, increasingly positive about girls being taught about money and economic empowerment. But when we asked more questions, we understood that communities can have a slightly superficially progressive attitude towards girls participating in the programs, because learning about it for them is one thing, but a girl actually using these skills, translating them into everyday life was actually a really different question. So some parents thought that girls should acquire those skills, not so they can make their own decisions and be independent and do in life whatever they want, but so they can take better care of their families without really challenging or changing the traditional roles. So that was our findings from India. And in Rwanda, we look at how the 2 clubs, the Boys for Change clubs and the leadership clubs, contribute to gender norms and how this interacts with students' acquisition of financial education and life skills. The findings show that boys and girls' attitudes and behavior really changed through the program. It has improved boys' attitudes and behavior a lot. They were much more engaged in work in and around the house, which is usually done by girls. But through the program, they increasingly understood that it was a good thing to contribute as well. And a really important consequence of this was that the girls were actually able to spend more time on their studies and engaging in entrepreneurial activities as part of the program, which was good for their economic empowerment. So the data collection for these studies have been finalized. We're in the process of reporting now, and we'll be summarizing and synthesizing and disseminating in the summer of this year. So I'm hoping to share more information about that soon. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to questions later on.
Thank you so much, Alkia. That was great. And just a reminder to all of our audience members, feel free to post questions on the chat box throughout the presentations, and we will address them at the end. I'm now going to jump into introducing our next speaker and our last speaker for today, Jackie Ogega. She is a Senior Associate for the Gender and Development Unit at Creative Associates. And she will be joined later by Sarah Phillips, also from Creative Associates, to present on gender-sensitive approaches they have taken in implementing the Nicaragua Technical Vocational Education and Training Strengthening for At-Risk Youth program. So Jackie, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Radhika. And I hope my camera is up there. Hello, everyone, and it's a pleasure for me to share our program together with my colleague Sarah Phillips, which is focused on technical vocational education and training strengthening for at-risk youth. The previous speakers have actually given a very good context to really share a little bit in more detail about this program. And although we have a agenda focus where we actually work with both male and female youth, our presentation today will focus on female youth. We will highlight the ways that we have really supported the female youth in our program, which we call TVET-SAY. It's a bold, just as our International Women's Day theme shows, it's a bold thing to do, to really focus on female and support them in these opportunities. As you can see from this image here of one of the women that we support on the slide, who actually talks about how she would like to make sure that women are out there, not doing the routine work that they do of childcare at home, but out there serving their communities and motivating others to serve their communities. Just a little background about TVET-SAY in brief. Our overarching goal of this program is to improve the security in the Caribbean coast by providing youth with education opportunities and linking to jobs and livelihoods, and also to strengthen institutions that offer technical and vocational education to meet market demand and to benefit at youth risk from the Caribbean coast in Nicaragua. It's USAID funded under the YouthPower, and we have up to 2019 to implement the activity. If we can move on to the next slide. Just a little bit about the components. One of the components is to improve collaboration and partnership among training centers, nonprofit organizations, working with at-risk youth, as I've shared. The second component is to build the capacity of the private TVET centers, and we strengthen their capacity to be model institutions and to also have organizational capacity, including gender integration, which we're going to see a little bit more later. Component 3 is public perceptions of TVET, to increase interest and perceived value of TVET programs through public awareness campaigns, especially along the Caribbean coast. And these activities are also gender targeted. And the fourth component is to increase socio-economic gains for at-risk youth from the Caribbean coast with enabling and safer environments. Just to also share that the geographic coverage in Nicaragua, we are focused on the very rural areas of the Caribbean coast and Chinandega. These are extremely rural areas, and the vulnerability levels are very high. So that's why it's important to target those communities where there's great risk and need. The first thing that we did in order to understand the risks and to address them more systematically was to do a youth-centered labor market assessment. And as you can see on the screen, those are the opportunities for economic development in the Caribbean that emerged from that study. We focused on training at-risk youth, particularly female youth who are already economically marginalized in the region. And we wanted to make sure that as we train these women, that the training was relevant to the market opportunities that existed, so that this assessment helped us to be much more targeted And it also complemented a gender study that we conducted at the beginning of the program, which provided as a baseline of female and youth perceptions on jobs and you know, the growth sectors that exist and the TVET programs. So the youth-led perception study also helped us to tailor, you know, activities for females and males. Although many more males understood these economic opportunities and the sectors than the females, we have seen that through our programming, more women, more females have actually attended and have ignored the stigma that most women don't engage in technical education, vocational education. So I'm going to share some good stories of some of the folks that we've worked with. Edith is a very bold example who has joined a non-traditional field and has decided to, you know, take on the field of, she's from Afro-Caribbean descent of ethnic minority, but she is in the automotive industry. And one of the things I want to highlight about her is the fact that the gender roles, the care that Sarah talked about, has impacted her. She has 2 children, a 10-year-old and a 2-year-old, and sometimes she has to bring them to work because she doesn't have childcare opportunities. So we are learning that certainly gender issues and gender needs, questions to do with care, do impact some of these young women as they enter these settings. But Edith is very determined despite what she has to do, and in fact bringing her son to work has a counter message for him. The 10-year-old asked her, why does she do a male job? And that provided an opportunity for her to train him and to deal with this stereotyping that women wouldn't do male-dominated jobs. The other person we would like you to meet today is Karen Hernandez, who also has joined, is from the Afro descent ethnic minority, but has joined a non-traditional field. She lives in one of the low-income neighborhoods, and she's the only female out of 50 automotive and electronic technicians that is at this training center. She's influenced by her siblings who have also gotten into non-traditional careers, but it's very impressive and very bold for these young women to really get into non-traditional fields and male-dominated spaces to continue this work and training on vocational training. I want to also share with you that one other activity that we have focused on is social media and behavior change communications campaign. You know, we've designed a communication campaign with emphasis on minority communities, especially women in non-traditional roles. And the channels we use are TV, social media, Facebook, blogs, messages, and so on. And this, you know, campaign has gone on very, very well. We have so many young women participating in this campaign. Actually, more young women have participated than the male people. So we believe that beyond the direct beneficiaries of this project, we are reaching many more young women into, you know, and breaking the barriers and stereotypes of what technical skills women could have. The next slide is an example of some of the ways you know, we've done this media campaigns. You can see the women in the photos present 3 different ethnic minorities. and even the colors and logos present six different ethnicities in Nicaragua, with different messages and different languages. And the theme that they have chosen, I learn and launch, and then I launch, is really an interesting way for them to take bold measures towards learning and TVETs. The other gender-focused activities we've done is to launch a network which really brings together all these sectors, the private sector, non-profit organizations, bylaws, and they are focused on, ensuring that there are bylaws and equal representation of women, and address policies that would create an enabling environment for including women and other minorities in the institutional level. And we've also provided technical training, capacity training for private sector and TVET centers that I mentioned earlier on gender and social inclusion policies, admissions, and hiring practices. And also the other focus is capacity building with media to enrich public understanding and perceptions about at-risk female youth related to technical vocational education. And finally, we've learned a few lessons that we would want to share with you. First of all, although we did conduct a gender assessment at the beginning of this project, we've learned that it's very important to continually mainstream strategies and in a very formal and targeted manner into project plans and activities. So this is, having a gender plan at the beginning and a gender assessment is not enough. We have to continually ensure that gender-related activities are integrated. And then we've also learned that gender empowerment is rooted in project activities, and it takes time and needs intentionality and champions. We've also learned that youth are very busy, so we want to be mindful when designing youth blogs and writing capacity and providing training for them, so that we also take care of the business, and especially for women, given the time poverty, some of our activities can unintentionally limit their capacity to participate. And then visibility materials in line with USAID guidelines and local development objectives are very important to continue to create those as we go on. I'm just going to share this final image of young women, students who are studying small business administration in the rural Nueva Guinea, where we work, and you can see how bold they are to really get into the business. And we are very delighted to speak with you. My colleague Sarah will be able to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, and all of our presenters. We're going to go ahead and kick off some Q&A. We've got a couple questions lined up, and please feel free to put more questions into the Q&A and into the chat box.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and I'm actually going to hand it over to Chelsea now to start the question and answer session.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much to all the presenters. We're going to go ahead and start with a couple of questions, and please feel free to put more into the chat box and into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time we have remaining. So, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we do. Yes.
Okay. Great. So we'll start with a question for Okia. Okia, can you go into a little detail on how you determined or defined net positive impact? And of the contextual factors that you listed on your theory of change slide, Did you find that any factors were more predictive of improved outcomes?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the questions. We looked at three things: at relevance, rigor, and results, like I said, right? So relevance assessed the degree to which the program and the evaluation had a primary focus on what we were actually looking at. Rigor was evaluated by assessing the quality of the evaluation of the program and the degree to which the results were observed and could actually be contributed to the program. And the results focus on how the program impacted the participants, and every program had different outcomes, but like I said, it's all in the area of financial knowledge, attitudes, behavior. Some add a component on rights and responsibilities. Some include components on civic engagement, for example. And so that's what we looked at. We did not look at effect sizes. So for the researchers among us, that's not what we looked at. But we've been comparing those outcomes, and so we looked at both how relevant the study was, how rigorous it's been examined, and how positive the results were at the end of the program. And your second question?
Yes, of the contextual factors that you listed on your theory of change slide, did you find that any factors were more predictive of improved outcomes?
More predictive? I don't know. Maybe Claire. Claire is on the call as well. She's the person at Plan International that we work with. So maybe Claire can say something about this.
Sorry, Claire, is your microphone on?
Or maybe you can phrase the question in a different way. That would work.
So it's a question we received in the box, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it for the moment, and maybe we can have you address it by email directly to.
Absolutely. Happy to look into that.
So Jackie, I'm going to follow up with a quick question for you that we received. What challenges did you have training young women for jobs in traditional sectors like mining and automotive? And how did you end up tailoring programs differently for women and men?
Hi, this is Sarah from Creative Associates. I'll take that question. So as of right now, currently, like the women in the image that you have on the screen that are focused on small business administration, those are specifically around small business administration for agricultural and mining. So at the moment, we're not currently training for the technical in the field type work. We're training for the office at this point in time. So we haven't had a demand from the private sector to fill any particularly mining jobs at the moment. They're still in the process of redoing some of the curriculum at the Nicaraguan government level, because the curriculum that they have for mining isn't meeting the market demand. So they're currently importing labor for those. So we're helping to convene the private sector and the government of Nicaragua to address those curriculum issues now. And we'll help them to prepare for the first round of cohort once that's completed, hopefully towards the end of this year, and we should have some results on that for next summer. So the other way that we're preparing both young women and the institutions is we've been doing some capacity building with the institution themselves on, what does it mean to be inclusive of women in these technical fields? Because sometimes when the women start, they have, they're discriminated against with their professors and things like that. So we've developed a training course, a certification course for the professors and the institutions to help them to reduce stigma and address some of those gender and social inclusion issues. The administration of these technical institutions has also taken a stand and said to their staff that this is going to happen, and if they find out about discrimination against women or minorities, that there will be consequences for that individual professor. And so we've really been able to kind of rally those institutions and kind of embed it at the leadership level to make sure that it's enforced and we create a positive environment for young women to study in and then eventually work in. On the other side, we're working with employers to, share success stories, to have women come give testimonials and talk directly to the private sector about, their just sharing their story, their capabilities and things like that, in order to kind of reduce this stigma that women can't do what men can do in particular fields. The young woman Edith that we introduced you to, she is, as Jackie was saying, she's 29 years old. She's in marine mechanics, which is an incredibly male-dominated field in the Caribbean coast, where the majority of travel on a daily basis is done via boat instead of via car. So not only has she been able to thrive in the classroom, but she's also been offered an internship after she graduates based on her reputation within the community. She's top of her class at the moment, so she's gained the respect of her fellow peers, and she's often mentoring some of the young men in the class on how to do things. And so, to the best of our ability, we try and create a positive environment on both sides. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks so much. So one from the Q&A box. In the speaker's experience, what are some examples of the specific policy levers that improve labor force outcomes for women? Sarah, this might be a good one for you to take. Sarah Gamage,
Okay,
I'm sorry.
I'm delighted to. Well, I think policy levers go sort of the gamut of labor market institutions. And I think when we talk about labor market institutions, we talk about what are the things that actually sort of strengthen and improve outcomes in labor markets. So some of the policy levers we've talked about a little bit, but we haven't necessarily talked about them as policy, but anti-discrimination policy, equal pay for equal work. These types of commitments are tremendously important because they create an opportunity for people to make claims on duty bearers about what the state can protect in terms of their jobs. So I think those are the kinds of policy levers. But I also think there are other policy levers in terms of labor demand stimulation and working on the labor demand side. So we know that there have been initiatives around sectoral policies that inject credit into certain sectors to expand jobs that may densely employ women or youth. We know that there have been successful initiatives as well, lowering the rate of interest on loans for small business loans. If you look at Brazil, previously, Brazil had worked very hard to roll out social protection to the informal economy so that you could actually improve the terms and conditions of employment, and that contributed to formalizing a lot of work. They also had collective bargaining by different types of sectors. This actually improved the terms and conditions of employment. So there's a host of policy levers out there that can stimulate demand and actually protect the terms and conditions of employment. But I think also you need to have sort of creative compacts between the private sector and the public sector around issues of, yes, we commit to hiring youth, we commit to reducing youth unemployment, and I think that's part of a sort of general consensus that has to be wrought with the state as an actor, and that not everything is a sort of is sort of an independent, atomistic type of initiative that takes place in the private sector.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next question about, we have a question of whether the organizations that you work with, the life skills curricula, incorporate gender dynamics and how that works. And also a slightly related question about whether people are tracking GBV in the job market. So I think we'll just throw that one open to all three.
So this is Sarah from
I would love to talk about GBV issues. It's Sarah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Great. So let's start with Sarah Phillips and then Sarah.
Great. So from a GBV perspective, we are not currently tracking work-related GBV on the job. We haven't run into that yet. However, I appreciate the comment, and I'd like to give that some more thought and see how we can we kind of integrate that into our programming. I would like to address the life skills curricula in incorporating gender specific. So I think one of the life skills and areas that we work on is around activities related to resilience. And while it's important for all youth, male and female, to be resilient, we've started incorporating specific activities related to resiliency in the workplace for women and LGBT. And so we're in the process of developing that and getting ready to pilot soon. And so I look forward to another session where we can talk about that in more detail in the upcoming months.
Can I leap in about GBV? I do think Thank you. I do think it's tremendously important for us to consider the impact of gender-based violence on your ability to work, your ability to leave the home, your ability to access public transport, and gender-based violence in the workplace. And I think it's worth our while keeping in our sights. The ILO will be having an international labor conference where gender-based violence in the workplace and on the way to work is actually featuring as an issue of concern, and I think it's been sort of long ignored in many ways. We do know some interesting features of what predisposes you to experience more violence in the workplace, and a lot of that has to do with the precarious nature of your work and the vulnerable nature of your work. So again, I think this surfaces the importance of having other types of mechanisms, dispute mechanisms, access to justice mechanisms, that protect the terms and conditions of your employment, and if something goes wrong, enable you to make claims against those who have, aggrieved you. And I think this is something that is really worth keeping on our radar, particularly in contexts where women face highly restrictive social norms about their mobility and what is acceptable for women to be seen doing outside of the home. So I do think that we haven't integrated enough of this both into our workforce development programming. I think it's probably there in a lot of the life skills programming, but less so in the workforce development programming. And I think we haven't integrated it enough in the provision of other parallel services like safe transport, better street lighting, the ability to negotiate hours and shifts and transport in ways that protect your bodily integrity going to and from work. So I think there's lots of areas where parallel policy would be tremendously rich and helpful in creating the enabling conditions for women to work, and particularly young women to work.
Great, thank you so much. I'm aware that we've run a little bit over time, so I'm going to ask each of the presenters to close by addressing one final question from the chat box about addressing competition between women and improving collaboration, and asking if any of you haven't come across or developed solutions that strengthen collaboration and refine empathy and communication among women. So maybe if we go in order of the presentations with Sarah Gamage and then Okia and then Jackie and Sarah Phillips.
I think I would modify the question just a little bit, because from my optic as an economist who works on sort of enabling conditions in labour markets, I'm more concerned about competition between workers than I am at that level. I know I seldom see the more sort of psychosocial, processual sort of component of the workplace. We look more at sort of how many jobs are available and how much competition is there for those jobs. So I think when we talk about the incredibly powerful role of workforce development, TVET, education, all of these types of initiatives that focus on the supply side, if we fail to consider the demand side, we actually don't address some of the competition that creates these challenges for people accessing jobs. And I would argue that if we can resolve that, we can probably resolve some of the other issues around sort of competition, interpersonal competition, because if it's about scarcity of employment opportunities and decent jobs, that might be where we should sort of invest the greatest amount of our energies in terms of marrying up both the demand and the supply side and generating policies that actually increase the envelope of what's possible in terms of jobs and decent jobs.
All right. So from our side, I think our programs focus a lot on teamwork and the work that the girls and the boys do in the clubs and in the classes. Is a lot about working together and accomplishing a common goal together. So at the end of the program, it's always around an activity, a social activity or a financial activity with a common goal. So whether it's between girls and girls or girls and boys or mixed groups or only girls, doesn't really matter. I think those sorts of activities really contribute to that goal of strengthening teamwork rather than something individual.
This is Sarah from Creative. So I'd like to second that. In our programming, we are also focusing on activity-based, after, post-training activities that allow for team building and, working together, whether it's across mixed groups or, just women alone. So that's the current activity level that we're doing to kind of address those issues. We are developing with the TVET centers, though, how to provide, like Sarah was saying, more of the psychosocial support and social support services to students as a whole. So we're doing capacity building with them to see what that's going to look like for them in their particular context. And so, as those kinds of activities take place, we can keep some of these things in mind and be able to report back to you at another time after we have some of those, more higher level activities happening up at the TVET centers. But for now, we're focusing on the program level, the individual level, where we're doing activities across genders to do team building exercises and things like that.
Great, thanks so much. And I think Claire's microphone should be working now. If Claire had anything she wanted to add really quickly.
I think this is the third time left. You can hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
We can hear you, but there's a very strong echo.
Okay. Just to wrap up what Alkia said, obviously we are hitting the young people at a sort of earlier stage in their development and their economic empowerment than the other organisations that we've heard from today. But certainly the types of interventions that we're introducing in our programme are seeing that the idea of teamwork and the idea of friendship in a way is really being brought to the fore. And I know a lot of the girls that I've met personally in our project in Brazil have really found that they have started to see that collaboration in a way that had never occurred to them before. That's all I wanted to add.
Great. Thanks so much, and thank you to everyone for your patience with the timing and with the echoes, and a huge thank you to our presenters. And all of this will be up on the YouthPower website. We will send out a link to everyone who is registered for the webinar. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, we will make sure to get them to the relevant presenters so that they can respond directly to you. So thanks again. Radhika, did you have any last?
Yeah, just huge thank you to all of our speakers today and to the 64 of you who attended this webinar. For any of you who are interested in learning more about our COPs, we have our contact details up here on the slide, so feel free to get in touch with us. But yeah, thank you to all of you for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar.